My stepmom smirked. Only first-class passengers are allowed in our family lounge. As we boarded the flight, so I pointed toward the runway and said, "That's interesting since I own the airport." Then kicked them all out. I honestly wish I could say I had some perfectly planned comeback ready when my stepmom said it. I didn't. At the time, I was standing in an airport holding a boarding pass, a laptop bag, and the kind of exhaustion you get from leaving for a business trip before sunrise. My dad, my stepmom, my younger half-brother, and I were all flying out for a family vacation that my dad had insisted on making into some kind of celebration. The problem was that my stepmom had spent the entire morning acting like the trip was a social ranking exercise. She kept checking who had what boarding group. She kept asking whether our hotel had a private car. She complained about the restaurant prices before we had even left the terminal. And then when we walked past the airline lounge, she stopped and looked at my half-brother. She told him he would be bored with the regular waiting area and that she would take him into the family lounge. My dad laughed. I assumed she was joking. Then she looked directly at me and told me I would have to wait outside. She made it sound like a normal rule. I was apparently not first class. She was, my dad was, my half-brother was. And because I had booked my own flight separately for work reasons, I was somehow the one person in the family who didn't belong. I just stared at her. She gave me that little smile she always used when she thought she had made a clever point. Then she said that only first-class passengers were allowed in their family lounge. What made it worse was that she said it loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. I remember feeling my face get hot. Not because I cared about the lounge. I didn't. I have spent plenty of time sitting in airport terminals. I know how to charge a laptop and eat an overpriced sandwich while staring at a departure board. What bothered me was how intentional it felt. My stepmom knew I was the one who had paid for most of the family arrangements. She knew I had upgraded my father's ticket as part of his birthday present. She knew I had personally arranged the transportation, hotel block, and private dining reservation for the trip. She knew because I had been handling the details for months. What she didn't know was that there was one more detail I had never told them. The airport we were departing from wasn't just an airport I had business dealings with. My family had never understood how much my company had grown. They still thought I ran a small aviation consulting firm that did paperwork and software contracts. They were wrong. Very wrong. But I didn't correct them because over time I had discovered something useful about people. Sometimes the easiest way to understand what somebody really thinks of you is to let them underestimate you. I had learned that lesson the hard way. My dad had been married to my mother for almost 20 years before they divorced. A few years later, he met my stepmom. She was polished, social, very concerned with appearances, and extremely good at remembering the names of people who could benefit her. She was also very good at making people feel included right before excluding them. At first, I thought that was just her personality. I tried to get along with her. I really did. I brought her gifts during the holidays. I remembered her birthday. I even helped her refinance the mortgage on the house after she complained about how confusing the paperwork was. I didn't mind helping. I had always been the practical person in the family. If something needed to be organized, I did it. If someone needed a spreadsheet, I made it. If there was an insurance form, I read it. If someone was confused about a contract, I sat down and explained it. That habit eventually became my career. After college, I started working in aviation technology. The company I eventually built was originally nothing more than a small software operation serving regional airport contractors. It wasn't glamorous. At the beginning, I spent more time in rented conference rooms than actual offices. I wrote code at night. I traveled constantly. I ate dinner from gas stations and airport kiosks. But the software worked. Then one airport signed a contract. Then another. Then a group of private investors came in. A few years later, my company wasn't just providing software anymore. We were involved in operations management, logistics systems, security integration, and infrastructure contracts. Eventually, we started acquiring stakes in airport-related properties and operating companies. I never thought of it as owning airports. That phrase sounded ridiculous to me. What I actually owned was a controlling interest in a private aviation holding company. The holding company owned several subsidiaries. One of those subsidiaries operated the airport where we were leaving from. Because of the way the ownership structure worked, I was not technically the person whose name appeared on every public-facing sign. The management company had its own executives. The airport had its own director. There were boards and attorneys and lenders and government agencies involved. I was the controlling owner. That was the important part. My family had no idea. I didn't hide it because I wanted some dramatic reveal. I hid it because every time I shared anything about my finances, the conversation somehow turned into an argument about what I should do for everyone else. When my business first became successful, my dad started asking questions. At first, they were harmless. He wanted to know whether I could help my half-brother with tuition. Then he wanted to know whether I could help with a down payment. Then he needed help paying a tax bill. Then my stepmom wanted to borrow money for a home renovation. I helped more than once. Eventually, I started noticing something. The more I helped, the more they acted like the help was expected. My dad had a way of saying things that sounded affectionate but carried a very specific implication. He would tell me how lucky I was. He would remind me that I didn't have kids. He would mention that my brother had a lot of expenses. My stepmom was more direct. She once told me that family money should stay in the family. I remember thinking that was strange because it wasn't family money. It was mine. Still, I didn't fight about it. I started separating things quietly, separate accounts, separate records, separate investments, separate passwords, no drama, just organization. That became especially important after an incident involving a credit card. My stepmom had used one of my cards during a family trip because she said her card was having issues. She promised she would reimburse me. She didn't. When I asked about it, she acted offended that I was treating her like a stranger. My dad eventually paid me back. That was when I stopped giving them access to anything financial. I didn't stop loving my dad. I didn't stop seeing my brother. I just stopped confusing love with financial access. That distinction became very important later. The airport lounge incident happened about 3 months after our family had settled into a weird version of normal. My dad's birthday was coming up. I had decided to take him on a vacation, not because of pressure, not because I owed him anything. I just wanted to do something nice. I booked premium seats for my dad and my stepmom. I paid for my brother's ticket. I booked my own separately because I needed to return earlier for work. I also arranged transportation from the airport and made sure the hotel knew that my father's birthday was during the trip. I kept all of this quiet because I knew my stepmom would turn it into a comparison. She couldn't stand finding out someone else had done something before she had. Sure enough, she discovered the ticket details. Then suddenly she was talking about how wonderful it was that we were all traveling first class together. I didn't correct her. She assumed I had upgraded myself too. I didn't. My flight was on a different itinerary because of my return schedule. I was flying business class. That still wasn't good enough for her. That morning we arrived at the airport together. My dad was in a great mood. My brother was half asleep. My stepmom had 3 bags despite us being gone for less than a week. Everything was normal until we reached the lounge entrance. My stepmom suddenly decided she was in charge. She gathered my dad and brother and said they could go inside. Then she looked at my boarding pass. She saw the class designation. I saw the exact moment she realized I wasn't booked in first class. She smiled, that same little smile. Then she told me only first-class passengers were allowed in the family lounge. I asked whether she was serious. She acted surprised that I had taken offense. She explained that the lounge was for people with first-class tickets. I reminded her that the reservation included lounge access. She shrugged. She said she wasn't going to argue about it. She just told me I could meet them at the gate. My dad looked uncomfortable. He started to say something. She interrupted him by telling him the lounge was already crowded. My brother looked at me and apologized. That was the part that actually hurt. He shouldn't have felt like he had to apologize. He was 17. He was just following what the adults around him were doing. I told him it was fine. Then I walked away. I sat down near a window and opened my laptop. I had a meeting scheduled with the airport operations team later that afternoon. One of the senior directors had been asking me for approval on a maintenance contract. I was reviewing the document when my phone buzzed. It was an email from the airport management company. The subject line was about temporary lounge access restrictions. I opened it. The airport had a problem. A private event was taking place in one of the executive lounges. Because of the occupancy limit, only passengers with verified premium credentials or guests approved by airport management were being admitted. I stared at that sentence. Then I leaned back. I understood what had happened. My stepmom had not simply excluded me. She had apparently decided that she had authority over the guest list. That was not her decision to make. I called the lounge manager. He knew me, not personally in the family sense, professionally. He confirmed that my family was inside. He also said they had entered under the reservation attached to my father's booking. That made me pause. I asked whether the reservation had guest permissions. He said it did. My father's ticket allowed a certain number of guests. I realized my stepmom had excluded me despite my own eligibility. There was no security violation. There was no rule requiring me to stand outside. She had simply made a social decision and pretended it was an airport rule. I could have corrected her right then. I didn't. I thought about walking over and making a scene. I didn't. Instead, I finished my work. About 40 minutes later, my dad came out of the lounge. He looked embarrassed. He sat next to me. He said my stepmom was upset because she thought I had deliberately booked a lower cabin to make them look bad. That made absolutely no sense to me. I told him I had booked the flight separately because I needed a different schedule. He said he understood. Then he asked why I hadn't told them about the airport. I looked at him. I asked what he meant. He became vague. Eventually, he admitted that my stepmom had heard me talking about ownership at a family dinner a few months earlier. I had mentioned one of our aviation subsidiaries. She apparently assumed I meant a small office building. My dad said she didn't realize how large the business was. I didn't think much of it. At that point, I still believed the lounge incident was just another example of her being petty. I didn't realize it was connected to something much bigger. We boarded the flight. My stepmom barely spoke to me. My brother kept trying to lighten the mood. My dad mostly looked out the window. The trip itself was fine. For the first few days, everyone tried to act normal. We had dinner. We went sightseeing. We spent too much money on room service. My brother rented a scooter. My dad bought a watch he didn't need. My stepmom posted photos constantly. I thought maybe the whole lounge thing would disappear. Then, on the fourth night, my dad called me. He said my stepmom had been upset all day. I asked why. He said she was convinced I was embarrassing her. I didn't understand. He explained that she had told relatives that I had deliberately tried to make her feel inferior by refusing to upgrade my ticket. I laughed because the idea was so absurd. Then I stopped laughing. My dad wasn't joking. He was asking me to apologize. I asked what exactly I was supposed to apologize for. He said I should have considered how the situation looked. That phrase stayed with me, how the situation looked, not what happened, not whether I had done anything wrong, just what it looked like. I told him I wasn't going to apologize for buying the flight that worked with my schedule. He sighed. Then he said something that made me realize the problem was deeper. He said my stepmom had been asking him how much money I made. I felt my stomach drop. I asked why. He said she was trying to understand whether I was hiding money from the family. I didn't respond for a few seconds. Then I told him my finances were private. He agreed. But the next morning, my stepmom brought it up herself. She said she had heard I had become very successful. She wanted to know why I had never told them. I told her I didn't think it was necessary. She said family should share important things. I told her I agreed. Then I asked why she had recently described me as someone who didn't belong in the lounge. She looked shocked. She claimed I was twisting her words. That was the first moment I realized she was not embarrassed about what she had done. She was angry that I remembered it accurately. I said I wasn't interested in fighting. She told me that was typical of me. She said I always acted morally superior because I had money. I told her I had never said I was better than anyone. She responded by saying I was proving her point. The conversation ended there. I went back to my room. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything. The lounge, the questions about my income, the comment about family money, the pressure on my dad, the way she suddenly cared about what I owned. It didn't feel connected before. Now it did. After we returned home, I went back to work. For about 2 weeks, things were quiet. Then my assistant forwarded me a message from our legal department. One of our airport properties had received a request for records. The request wasn't unusual. Government agencies and legal representatives requested documents all the time, but the name attached to the inquiry was my stepmom's. I thought there had to be some mistake. I asked our counsel to investigate. The answer came back 3 days later. My stepmom had been asking questions about one of the airport operating companies. She had contacted a vendor and apparently implied that she had authority to discuss family-owned assets. She didn't. She wasn't an owner. She wasn't an officer. She wasn't an authorized representative. She was just my stepmother. My attorney asked whether I wanted the contact stopped. I said yes. He suggested we document everything before taking any action. That was good advice. I pulled records, emails, call logs, vendor correspondence, meeting notes, nothing dramatic, but together they created a pattern. My stepmom had been making inquiries for months. She had asked one vendor whether the airport could be used for a private event. She had asked another whether certain VIP services could be arranged. She had even asked about whether she could receive complimentary access to an executive area. She had been presenting herself as part of the ownership group. That bothered me. Not because I cared about the lounge, because it created liability. If she represented herself as someone with authority, vendors might rely on that. That could become a real problem. I called my dad. I told him what I had found. He was shocked. He said he didn't know. I believed him. He had never been very interested in the technical side of my business. My stepmom apparently was. That night I went through old family emails. I remembered something she had asked me months earlier. She wanted to know the name of the company that managed the airport. At the time, I thought she was making conversation. Now I remembered the way she had asked. She had been very specific. I had ignored that warning sign. That bothered me more than anything. I called my attorney again. We decided to send a formal notice making it clear she had no authority to act on behalf of any company I controlled. There was no accusation, no threat, just a written clarification. My attorney sent it through the proper channel. My dad called me that evening. He sounded angry, not with me, with the situation. He told me she was furious. She believed I had humiliated her. I asked him why she would feel humiliated by a factual letter stating she wasn't authorized to represent a company. He didn't have an answer. Then he asked me whether I had really built something as large as people were saying. I told him yes. He was quiet. He said he had underestimated me. That sentence hurt in a strange way. I wasn't looking for his approval, but hearing him admit that he had underestimated me made me wonder how many times I had allowed that to happen. A few weeks later, my stepmom demanded a family meeting. My dad wanted me to attend. I agreed. We met at their house. My brother was there. He seemed uncomfortable. My stepmom had printed out several pages of documents. She put them on the table. They were screenshots of public business filings and articles about airport management companies. She had highlighted my name where it appeared in ownership records. Then she started making accusations. She said I had deliberately hidden the truth. She said I had manipulated my father. She said she deserved access to family assets because she was married to him. That last part was the one I couldn't understand. I told her that marriage to my father did not create ownership in my separate company. She said I was being technical. I told her that ownership was technical. It was literally the point. She accused me of using wealth to control the family. I told her the only person who had been talking about my money was her. My dad tried to calm things down. My brother eventually left the room. I stayed calm. I didn't yell. I didn't insult her. I just answered each accusation with facts. She kept saying the same thing. Family should share. I kept explaining that shared family life did not mean shared ownership. Eventually, she admitted something. She said she had assumed that because I had so much money, I would eventually put my assets into a family trust. I asked why. She said because that was what responsible family members did. I realized then that she had built an entire future around money I had never promised her. That wasn't my fault, but it explained a lot. The lounge wasn't about first class. It was about status. She had spent years comparing herself to other people. When she realized I was wealthier than she thought, she had started looking for ways to establish her place in that world. The problem was that she wanted access without responsibility. She wanted prestige without ownership. She wanted to benefit from decisions she had no part in making. The meeting ended badly. My dad didn't take her side. That seemed to anger her even more. A few days later, she sent my dad a long message saying I had manipulated him. He showed it to me. I didn't respond. I told him that arguing through text wasn't going to fix anything. I also told him to keep the messages. He asked why. I said because when people are emotional, they sometimes rewrite events later. At the time, I didn't realize how right I would be. About 6 weeks later, I received a call from our insurance broker. There had been a question about a private event reservation connected to my stepmom. Apparently, she had approached an event planner and said she could secure access to a restricted airport facility. The planner had put down a deposit. The event was supposed to be for one of her friends. When the airport team reviewed the arrangement, they discovered that she had no authorization. The event planner demanded the deposit back. My stepmom apparently insisted the airport had approved it. The planner threatened legal action against the company. At that point, I had to get directly involved. Our attorney handled the communications. We refunded the deposit to the appropriate party to avoid unnecessary escalation. The amount wasn't enormous. The headache was. My stepmom had created a business problem because she wanted to impress someone. That crossed a line. My dad finally admitted that he didn't know how to deal with her. He said he felt like every disagreement became a loyalty test. I told him that wasn't my marriage to manage. I loved him, but I couldn't fix his relationship. He needed to decide what he was willing to tolerate. He eventually started sleeping in the guest room. Then he contacted a marriage counselor. That gave me some hope. I thought maybe things could improve. For a while, they did. My stepmom stopped contacting the airport. She stopped asking about my finances. She stopped bringing up the lounge. I thought the worst was over. Then my father received a certified letter. It was from an attorney. The letter demanded financial information relating to certain family assets. My stepmom claimed that because she was married to my father, she had a right to information concerning his finances. That was a separate issue. My father's personal finances were not mine. I made that distinction immediately. I didn't interfere. My dad hired his own attorney. The lawyer reviewed everything. It turned out the demand wasn't based on actual ownership. It was based on assumptions about what my father might receive from me in the future. That was when I realized my stepmom had been building a legal argument around something imaginary. She had no claim to my company. She had no ownership stake. She had no management role. She had no written agreement with me. She simply believed that family relationships should eventually produce financial access. My dad was devastated, not because he was losing money, because he finally understood how far things had gone. Their marriage ended a few months later. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. My dad moved into a small apartment. He started therapy. My half-brother spent more time with me. He was finishing high school and trying to navigate the fallout. I made sure he understood that none of it was his fault. He told me he had felt embarrassed about the lounge incident for months. I told him he didn't need to. I explained that adults sometimes make bad choices and younger people get caught in the middle. He asked me whether I had really planned to kick them out of the airport that day. I laughed. I told him no. I had never planned that. What actually happened was much less dramatic. After my stepmom's actions created repeated problems with the airport company, the board approved a stricter access policy for private facilities. My stepmom's name was added to the internal watch list for unauthorized requests. That didn't mean she was banned from the airport as a passenger. It meant she couldn't represent herself as someone with authority. Later, when she tried to use a private executive area with a guest pass arranged through a vendor, the security team stopped her. She called my dad. My dad called me. I told him I wasn't getting involved in the argument. The airport followed its policy. That was it. There was no dramatic security confrontation, no police dragging anyone away, no screaming. Just a simple refusal because she didn't meet the requirements. That was actually more satisfying than anything I could have planned. For years, she had acted like rules were for other people. Now the rules were simply being applied to her. A few months after the divorce, my dad asked if we could sit down. We met at a diner. He apologized, not for the lounge, for a lot of things. He admitted that he had spent years assuming I would always be the easy one, the dependable one, the son who didn't complain. He realized that sometimes people mistake calmness for weakness. That hit me. I told him I had made mistakes too. I had hidden too much. I had assumed silence would keep the peace. I had let things slide because I didn't want family conflict. I told him that wasn't healthy. He agreed. We talked for hours. For the first time in years, we talked without anyone trying to prove anything. My dad eventually asked whether I was angry at my stepmom. I said yes, but not in the way he thought. I wasn't plotting anything. I wasn't trying to ruin her life. I was angry that I had ignored so many warning signs. I was angry that I had let myself believe being reasonable would automatically make other people reasonable too. It doesn't. Sometimes reasonable people still get manipulated. Sometimes being calm doesn't prevent conflict. It just prevents you from making the conflict worse. My relationship with my half-brother grew stronger after that. He started working part-time while finishing school. He was proud of earning his own money. I encouraged that. I did pay for his college application fees. I did help him understand student loans, but I made a point of not creating dependency. I wanted him to know that receiving help didn't mean giving up independence. That was another lesson I had learned. Money can solve problems. It can also create expectations. You have to be careful about which one you're creating. My stepmom eventually moved away. I heard from relatives that she told people I had thrown her out of an airport I owned because she had embarrassed me. That story wasn't exactly true. I never personally kicked her out. I didn't need to. The policies did that. The documentation did that. The ownership records did that. The truth did that. Still, I understood why the version she told sounded better. It gave her a villain. It made her look like someone who had been punished by a cruel stepson instead of someone who had repeatedly crossed boundaries. I never corrected every version of the story. I didn't have the energy. The people who mattered knew what happened. The people who wanted the dramatic version would have believed it anyway. About a year after the lounge incident, my dad came to visit me at the office. He had never actually seen the full operation. He had visited one of my old offices years earlier. This was different. There were teams working on systems I barely understood. There were conference rooms full of engineers. There were operations staff tracking aircraft movements and logistics. There were financial people discussing multi-million-dollar contracts. He looked around for a long time. Then he told me he couldn't believe I had built all of it. I told him I couldn't either. That was the truth. I still didn't feel like I owned an airport. I felt like I owned a company that happened to have a controlling interest in airport operations. The distinction mattered to me because I had never wanted to be defined by money. My stepmom had made money the center of every interaction. I didn't want that. After everything happened, I changed the way I handled family finances. I stopped discussing income. I stopped explaining investments. I stopped making large gifts without clear boundaries. I stopped letting people use guilt to turn generosity into obligation. And I started putting more things in writing, not because I had become paranoid, because I had learned that memory is flexible, especially when people are hurt. Documents are less emotional. A written agreement doesn't get offended. A bank record doesn't change its story because somebody is angry. A company policy doesn't care who your father married. A property deed doesn't care about family hierarchy. That entire experience changed how I thought about power. I had always assumed power meant having money or influence. It doesn't. Real power in situations like this is being able to stay calm enough to separate emotion from facts. That was what saved me. I could have confronted my stepmom in that lounge. I could have embarrassed her. I could have told everyone who I was. I could have made a huge scene. Instead, I sat down, opened my laptop, and waited. That turned out to be the better choice, because once I started looking at what had actually happened, the pattern became obvious. She wasn't just being rude, she was testing boundaries. She had been testing them for years. The lounge was just the first time I finally stopped ignoring it. There was another strange consequence. After the divorce, several relatives who had stayed neutral started calling me. They wanted details. Some apologized. Some claimed they had suspected something. A few admitted they had believed my stepmom's version. I didn't hold it against them. People believe the story they hear first. What mattered was that when they saw the paperwork, they understood. One family member asked me whether I had deliberately revealed my wealth to force my stepmom out. That question annoyed me. I explained that my wealth had nothing to do with the marriage ending. The marriage ended because two adults couldn't maintain a healthy relationship. I was not responsible for that. My only responsibility was protecting my business from unauthorized actions. That distinction became important to me. I didn't want to rewrite history and make myself the hero. I wasn't. I was just finally willing to enforce boundaries I should have enforced earlier. My dad eventually rebuilt his life. He found a smaller place. He started traveling again. He took up fishing. He started cooking more. He also stopped relying on other people to manage his finances. That was probably the healthiest change. Our relationship wasn't perfect after everything. We still argued sometimes, but the arguments were different. He started asking instead of assuming. I started explaining instead of withdrawing. That took work. My brother graduated. I helped him buy a used car, but I made him sign a simple repayment agreement. He laughed about it. He told me it was the most brother thing I had ever done. He was right. I didn't need the money back. I needed him to understand that help and responsibility can exist together. Years later, I still think about that airport lounge. Not because of the insult, not because of the look on my stepmom's face, not because of the fact that I could have embarrassed her in front of everyone. I think about it because that was the moment I finally saw the difference between being patient and being passive. For a long time, I thought keeping the peace meant letting things go. I don't believe that anymore. Sometimes keeping the peace just means letting bad behavior continue, because confrontation feels uncomfortable. I learned that boundaries are not revenge. Records are not revenge. Legal paperwork is not revenge. Refusing access to something you own is not revenge. There is a difference between punishing someone and simply refusing to let them use you. That difference changed my life. And the funny thing is, if my stepmom had never made that comment at the lounge, I might have kept ignoring the warning signs. I might have kept believing the occasional financial request was harmless. I might have kept treating every uncomfortable conversation as something that would eventually blow over. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe it would have gotten worse. I don't know. I only know that once I started paying attention, I saw things I had been trained not to see. That was the hardest part. I had spent years thinking I was the rational one, the calm one, the person who could handle anything. What I had really become was someone who tolerated too much because I didn't want conflict. There is a difference. I learned that difference at an airport. I learned it when somebody looked at my boarding pass and decided it gave her permission to decide whether I belonged. She thought the first-class cabin was the important part. It wasn't. The important part was that she believed status gave her authority. It didn't. And when the situation finally reached a point where her behavior had consequences, I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to threaten anyone. I didn't have to invent a trap. I didn't have to get revenge. I just had to let the records speak. The ownership documents said what they said. The contracts said what they said. The emails said what they said. The security logs said what they said. The policies said what they said. And eventually everyone had to deal with reality instead of the version of reality they preferred. My stepmom once told people that I had kicked her out because she wasn't good enough to be part of my world. That isn't how I remember it. I remember sitting alone near a charging station while she enjoyed the lounge, wondering why someone I had welcomed into my family had decided I didn't belong in the same room. I remember feeling embarrassed. I remember questioning whether I was overreacting. I remember trying to make excuses for her. And I remember looking at an email on my laptop that happened to mention access restrictions and realizing something important. The rules had nothing to do with me. She had simply used the rules as an excuse to treat me badly. That realization changed everything that came after. I didn't become colder. I became clearer. I still help people. I still give generously. I still love my family. I still believe people deserve second chances. But I don't confuse love with unlimited access anymore. And I definitely don't mistake a family title for a legal right. My dad and I are actually closer now than we were before all of this. My brother and I talk almost every week. My company is still growing. The airport is still there. The lounge is still there too. I have never gone back just to prove a point. I have no interest in that. The last time I walked through that terminal, I was on my way to a meeting. I passed the same entrance. I noticed the same polished doors. For a second, I remembered my stepmom smiling and telling me that only first-class passengers belonged inside. I almost laughed, not because I had one, because I finally understood that I had never been losing in the first place. I was just standing in a place I had spent years being too polite to claim, and when I finally stopped letting other people define where I belonged, I didn't need to say much at all. The facts were already there. That turned out to be enough.